It's all good?
And while we're talking about new things,
welcome, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Paul Yacht, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Public Life of Arts and Ideas and the director of the project called Early Modern Conversions, Religions, Cultures, Cognitive Ecologies. Delighted to welcome you here and Elizabeth here today. Let me tell you about two upcoming events, and then we'll go around the table and introduce ourselves. On March 27th, 5 p.m. In Bronfman 423, Felipe Fernandez Armesto, a very eminent scholar, will be visiting us, and the subject of his talk is change, which is different from conversion. April 4th at 3:30 in the afternoon, a roundtable on conversion and modernity with Marguerite Deloguet from philosophy, Alberto Perez Gomez from architecture, and Jose Martin from Hispanic Studies in Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. So welcome. Julie, we're just going to go around the table, so why don't you introduce yourselves and we'll introduce ourselves to each other.
Hi, I'm Julie Cumming. I'm a member of the Conversions Project. I'm a musicologist. I'm an associate dean of the Schiller School of Music.
I'm Colleen Gray. I work between, sometimes at McGill, sometimes at Concordia. I'm also doing contract writing, history of the study school in Montreal at the moment.
Elspeth Heyman, I teach history here at McGill, and I have to leave at 20 after an hour, so about that.
Virginia Preston, a postdoc faculty.
Lydia Etter, historian and executive director of the Institute for Public Life, Arts and Ideas.
I'm Yelena Shifolu. I'm a PhD student in architecture.
Matt McCarthy, PhD student in history.
I'm Cyrus, visiting professor of government history.
Qifeng Lin, PhD student in environmental ethics.
My name is Emmanuel Hogg. I'm also a doctoral student at Carleton University in history.
Erin Bell, PhD candidate, history department.
Representing PhD candidate here at McGill.
Colin Gilmore, also.
I'm Bisha. I'm doing my BA in history here.
I'm Nina. I'm also an undergrad in history.
My name is Vincenzo Macedo. I'm also a PhD student working with Elizabeth Elbourne and John Sowski. My field is African history.
My name is Kyla Madden. I work at Meeting Queens and been publishing Elizabeth's first book. But I'm interested in religious history, so it's here purpose.
Let me tell you a little bit about Elizabeth, though a number of you know all of this. She is, as you know, chair of history and cultural and classical studies. She's the co-editor of the Journal of British Studies. Her first book is called Blood Ground, Colonialism, Missions and the Contest for Christianity in the Cape and Britain. She's co-edited a book with Gwen Campbell called Sex, Power, and Slavery. Her work is on comparative indigenous history, history of settler colonialism, history of religion, gender, and colonialism. She's a book in progress on family networks, settler colonialism, and debates over indigenous rights from the 1770s to the 1840s. She's using examples of three family networks over time. Today, her talk is called Emotion and the Conversion Narrative, Conversion and the Invention of the Self in the Early Protestant Missionary Movement, 1770.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here and looking forward to everybody's feedback. I'm actually going to discuss the mothership of conversion, namely real evangelical ideas about conversion. I actually suspect that Paul may have laughed slightly when I said I was really going to talk about Christian evangelical conversion in its literal sense. But I'm hoping that it might have some implications for this project, because I think many of the tropes of conversion in this narrower sense are multiplied and replicated in many different contexts. So this paper first examines the evangelical conversion story in Britain itself as a narrative with genre assumptions. both as a technique to discipline the self and its wayward emotions, and in itself a powerful emotional tool. The conversion narrative often structured the way in which Protestants of a certain bent thought about themselves and reflected on their own life stories and were able to tell themselves stories about their lives. So these narratives told by and about individuals also played an important role in the institutional life of communities. In the second half of the paper, I examined the transposition of the conversion narrative to colonial contexts with important political implications. So since this is a story that is partly about, a paper that is partly about stories, I want to start with some examples of conversion narratives drawn from a single year's worth of obituaries and memoirs in the Evangelical magazine in the beginning of the 19th century. The Evangelical magazine was, as its title suggests, at the time a leading periodical published by British Protestant evangelical dissenters, who also worked closely with the London Missionary Society and were in the vanguard of promoting Protestant missions to the non-Christian world, which at the time was a novel form in Britain. The closeness of links is underscored by the fact that the evangelical magazines at various points included a sister publication, the Missionary Chronicle. Its pages were replete with biographical accounts of conversion and of good deaths. Journal editors clearly saw biography as a spiritual tool, quote, to impart or to impress profitable instruction should be the object of every composition, but biography, capitalized, seems to be the most useful species of literature, especially when the subjects of it have been religious, wise, and useful, as one memoirist opined. In 1811, many of these accounts turned centrally on the conversion of nominal Christians to true Christianity, enabled thereby to come to a true knowledge of the self, accompanied by radical emotional shifts. So we read, for example, in February 1811, about the painful death from consumption of Miss Anne Lucraft in her mid-20s. Although her childhood conduct was what is generally esteemed moral, until her final illness she was destitute of vital religion and was living without hope and without God. However, God was pleased to afflict her with tuberculosis, reflecting the evangelical belief that suffering was a sign of God's blessing. Visitors from a local church tried to provoke a conversion experience. Lucraft's initial claim that God was merciful and she hoped he would forgive her led to, quote, an explanation of the total and universal depravity of our nature and our consequent inability to obtain happiness by our own works or deservings. Despite the sick woman's perhaps understandable initial aversion to her visitors, after several weeks she became convinced of her sinfulness, and she remained under strong convictions of sin for some weeks. When the Lord was pleased to bless an explanation of some scriptures, particularly Job and Lamentations, and through them to reveal himself to her as the Lord who had blotted out her transgressions for his own name's sake, and her joy on that occasion, she said, was unutterable. So this was a narrative about profound change as the ill woman renounced the world. She felt sensible that God had wrought a great change in her soul, insomuch that the things she once loved she now esteemed of no value, and the objects which had become of the highest importance in her esteem were the things she had before despised and neglected. In the same year, the Evangelical magazine memorialized an Anglican Irish clergyman, the Reverend John Isaac Harrison. And Harrison had been, quote, a clergyman of the established church upwards of 20 years before he became savingly acquainted with the things of God. In other words, he may have been an Anglican clergyman, but he wasn't actually saved. He had thought, like so many clerical gentlemen of fashion, that there were no problems with, quote, the cheerful song, the innocent game of cards, or the generous glass. But following the classic trope of a conversion narrative, Harrison became aware of his own sin through encountering street preachers in an Irish town of Naas. And Methodist preachers delivered a sermon on the harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few, and Harrison realized that instead of being a faithful laborer, he had been an idler and an unprofitable servant, and became a new creature. So again, there's a moment of transition. He introduced himself to the preachers and brought him back to his house, where they encountered a numerous party, all busy in playing at cards, unfortunately including Mrs. Harrison. An awkward silence was followed by a discussion of the idle practice of card playing, during which Mrs. Harrison asked, "Sir, what harm is there in card playing?" And one of the preachers answered, "Madam, I do consider it to be a heinous profligacy, but is it not also a loss of time, a forgetfulness of God?" To which Mrs. Harrison apparently replied with some ingenuity, "We have time enough, for we have no other amusements when we meet together on a winter evening." However, the preacher successfully persuaded Mrs. Harrison that she had not yet exhausted the joys of Bible reading. So the Reverend Harrison continued in his promising path until his death, virtuously refusing invitations to attend balls and introducing a Sunday evening sermon in his own house, all of which doubtless enlivened the life of Mrs. Harrison even further. And as the genre convention of the spiritual memoir required, he was enabled to have a good death after catching a fever, speaking of God and heavenly things on his deathbed. Such a memoir, stereotypical as it sounds, was a memoir of oral and written sources. Someone must have recounted the encounter between the card players and the Methodist preachers, perhaps Harrison himself. These memoirs, selected relatively at random, rehearse a narrative arc that was both rooted intellectually in particular theological beliefs and experienced as a set of emotions. Evangelical theology held that humanity was inherently depraved and damned without God's saving grace. This was particularly rooted in Calvinist theology. No one was immune, even clergymen. Ignorance was part of this depravity. And paradoxically, one could only know one was saved by realizing how sinful one was. Autobiographies and diaries suggest that this created very emotionally difficult binds. Knowledge of one's own sinfulness was a gift from God, since it signaled the redemptive capacity to change one's life. This was a sign of the grace of God. Knowledge was thus an instrument of salvation, but false knowledge was constantly possible. How did you know that emotion, or a flash of recognition of sinfulness, truly came from God, rather than from the sinful and fallible self, especially when the content of that knowledge was precisely about the fallibility of the self? Not surprisingly, both conversion experiences and the lack of them were emotionally fraught. People sometimes worried they did not feel sufficiently depraved. David Crowther, whose death at the age of 21 was also chronicled in the Evangelical magazine, wrote in a personal reflection on his religious experience, "I have often been distressed, fearing I have not seen into my own vileness and the evil of sin, as real Christians do, because I've never had such terrors of mind as many have felt. I find my heart very hard and careless, and am far from knowing myself as I ought." But he comforted himself by the thought that perhaps God had given him to see and feel something of my inbred corruption gradually, and so discovered unto me the way of pardoning mercy with the suitableness and sufficiency of Christ as a Saviour, in order to keep me from despair and such deep distress as others have experienced. But even on his deathbed, he continued to be tortured by the thought that he was, quote, "nothing but an empty professor, and destitute of those marks which are peculiar to the children of God." Although ultimately, the memoirist concludes that God sent him an insurance of grace as he was dying. The private letters and diaries of Anglican clergyman Henry Venn give some insight into expectations about conversion, again from a Calvinist perspective. Henry Venn's son, John Venn, was a founding member of the Church Missionary Society, and his grandson was an honorary secretary and a key strategist in the Victorian Church Missionary Society. For what it's worth, one of Henry Venn's great-grandsons changed course and invented the Venn diagram. Henry Venn was also the great-grandfather of Leslie Stephen, author of the Dictionary of National Biography, and the great-great-grandfather of Virginia Woolf. All of which hints at some ways in which evangelicalism was deeply embedded in the DNA of some great Victorian families. So Henry Venn, back in the 1770s, watched his son John with great anxiety, waiting for signs of a conversion experience. In 1775, he wrote to his then 16-year-old son, who had finally expressed a sense of his wickedness, "Dear Jackie, I desire to be very thankful to the Lord for his great goodness in bringing you to feel with an afflicted mind that you are a very wicked and sinful creature." He recounted how God, when he wished to show a person mercy, quote, "gives us eyes to see ourselves and our behavior in the light of truth. I remember well the hours when God, in his amazing grace, began to wound my self-sufficient spirit that he might lead me, and would thank him every day for the pain and trouble I have gone through on account of my being so detestable a sinner." So you can see the nexus here between suffering, self-knowledge, emotion, and then a new sense of the self. Now, not all memoirs, obituaries, and autobiographical accounts in the evangelical tradition were as stereotypical or structured as this analysis suggests. In fact, I think one of the most interesting memoirs in the Evangelical magazine of 1811 is, in my opinion, a pretty rambling personal account by the anonymous author of the life of an evangelical plantation owner in the West Indies, who evangelized his own slaves while remaining convinced that his slave ownership was morally justifiable, but not his past sexual relationships. Nonetheless, the theological expectation that an individual who was saved would have a conversion experience with chronological contours, with emotional stages, was a central evangelical trope. Critically, this was true for those born within the Christian tradition and not merely the heathen. Such expectations shaped not only the ways in which lives were remembered, but also how many people thought about their own lives as they unfolded. There was always a before and an after, even if backsliding and despair might complicate the picture. Many missionaries in the 1790s and 1800s cut their teeth on trying to elicit conversion experience among the British themselves. And many of these missionaries were working class. They were preaching in unconventional contexts, often in fields or outside the bounds of the established church, and they used their own conversion stories as a way to claim authority. A well-told conversion story might also serve an institutional function, somewhat akin to the academic letter of reference. In some dissenting churches, including Congregationalist chapels, producing a convincing conversion story was an important part of persuading a congregation to admit someone to membership, which would enable them to take communion. John Owen Sugg, a servant in Weymouth who died tragically young at the age of 27 of the consequences of a severe cold, left a written account of his spiritual life that he had submitted to the congregation in Weymouth and that the Evangelical magazine in turn cited in his obituary. He told how, although he was good as a child, my goodness resembled the morning cloud and the early dew. I became hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Sugg's conscience was awakened by an alarming dream which plunged him into darkness and deep distress until he heard a sermon by Dr. Cragnell on a text from Hebrews. My days of deep distress were now ended, and I felt joy unspeakable and full of glory. The conversion narrative was thus also in some ways a form of autobiography, that every converted individual would be expected to be able to recount, at least in certain contexts. It was a sign of one's salvation. At various points, for example, applicants to be missionaries to the London Missionary Society in the late 18th and early 19th century were required to give accounts of their conversion stories and of their spiritual experience. Over the coming summer, I'm actually hoping to read through the candidates' papers of the London Missionary Society from the 1790s to the 1820s, years in which most applicants were working class, to pursue work on conversion narratives as a form of autobiography and possibly as a way of thinking about working class, more vernacular autobiographies. But here's just one or two examples. In 1814, for example, William Ellis recounted he had very little formal education. He had left home very young, and I went to work in the garden, to which I have become long accustomed. He was concerned with his soul at the age of 18 after a lecture to young persons preached in London by the Reverend Clayton Sr. He had not long felt the pleasures of religion before I felt anxious to impart them to others. I felt an earnest desire to become a missionary after hearing a sermon preached at Kingsland Chapel. And once again, this is classic trope of a moment in which a sermon is heard or a text is read, but then triggers the knowledge of the sinful self in the moment of conversion. John Edmund told how he worked in Bengal, where he had become familiar with several overseers of indigo factories. He came home on what was supposed to be a short trip to Manchester, where he experienced conversion. He was asked by the London Missionary Society to become a missionary to Bengal. Uncertain what to do, he said, I waited for God. He waited for God to send him a dream or to apply his word with energy to my soul. Instead, one morning as I was putting on my clothes, thinking on what took up almost all my thoughts, I wish I knew what to do. These words came into my mind. Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Coming not with accustomed energetic force to the soul, but rather with a gentle, heart-reviving influence. Before I move to the second half of my paper, in which I try to talk about this in a missionary and colonial context, let me make a little more explicit a couple of points I've been trying to illustrate by example. The first is that telling stories about conversion and religious experience was also a way of telling an autobiography or framing a biography. Conversion created a way of thinking about the trajectory of a life through time, with the assumption that conversion enabled a life to be understood truly and for an individual to come to self-knowledge. Secondly, given the interplay between autobiography and biography, and the diverse contexts in which conversion stories might be narrated, the conversion narrative is sometimes a multi-authored form, in which oral and written formats overlapped and indeed reinforced one another. Even if such a narrative was about the individual self and its process of coming to self-consciousness. Conversion narratives often had a performative dimension. They were stories that were recounted in public context to particular ends. So they may be best understood in a multifaceted manner that takes account of orality and performativity, as well as the disciplining pen of the author. Thirdly, emotion played a key role in the conversion narrative, following certain theological assumptions about emotion, but also more broadly the less manageable emotions of a feeling subject terrified of damnation. The emotion of despair was in itself a means of communication with God and was expected to be followed by the emotions of joy and peace with the recognition of God's grace. Despite the constant struggle between the idea of a religion of the heart and a religion of the head, which Andrew Tallon, among others, highlights as typical of Christianity, Protestant theology created a certain set of expectations about the emotional experience of the Christian life that often, in fact, united emotion and reason. These included the emotional way stations to be traversed during the conversion experience in at least some theological variants of Protestantism. So emotion in this sense was intimately linked to knowledge. But what happened when this complicated form was transposed to what contemporaries were coming to call the quote-unquote mission field in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, in areas that were clearly coming increasingly under European colonial control? This is a very difficult question, and it would be impossible to generalize about wildly different societies and different colonial situations. But I do want to hazard, although with a sense of trepidation, some arguments about structural issues that repeated through time and space. I'm going to make three broad categories of argument. First, that missionaries tried to translate intimate individual experience into fodder for transnational networks, translating often the oral to the written, and attempting to universalize the experience of their converts. Secondly, however, that the politics of conversion were actually very different on the ground, on violent colonial frontiers, than many neat narratives suggested. And here I will use some examples drawn from Southern Africa and what is now the northeastern United States. Thirdly, the frustration of emotional expectations was actually a common experience of missionaries and contributed to a growing colonial discourse about indigenous societies as sinful and ignorant. The society that refused conversion could be construed as not having attained true knowledge or true selfhood or true manhood. So in all of this, conversion took on unexpected meanings and often shifted from individual to collective uses and became deeply embedded in colonial politics. So let me first talk about conversion and the missionary text. Despite the spiritual and political disorder from a missionary perspective of many of the societies in which they were working, missionaries constantly struggled to impose order as they perceived it and to appear in control to an international audience. The conversion narrative quickly passed from being an intimate, interior experience to becoming fodder for transnational communication networks. Missionary societies created a vast sea of written texts, including the Evangelical magazine, relying heavily on the audience created and sustained by these texts for things such as donations, prayer partners, and future missionaries. In this context, it was very much hoped that converts would display emotions publicly, particularly in more evangelical missions. Inquirers were often requested to attest to religious feeling in public. Missionaries would then write about their converts, experiencing and displaying appropriate emotion, in reports which in turn were important source material for missionary publications. A key genre was the convert biography. These biographies typically mirrored conversion narratives, but also displayed the conversion of the convert for public consumption. In 1834, for example, John Phillip, the superintendent of the London Missionary Society in Southern Africa, bluntly clarified for a shy colleague how important it was not only to have religious experiences, but also to write about these experiences. It is a strange thing that you will neither tell us what God has done for your own soul, or what he has done or is doing for the souls of your people. The great thing is to be the instrument of doing good, but it should never be forgotten that the spirit of missions at home cannot be kept up without intelligence from the field, and that the man that does not write as well as speak for God is not doing all he should, and is withholding that impulse which he ought to give to the course of missions over the whole world. As Jennifer Cooper observes, the conversion story was produced by the convert and told to the missionary, but then reduced to writing, packaged, and marketed for an international audience in a manner that she claims asserts the power of the missionary. Now, I agree with this important observation. The missionary disciplined, produced, translated, and indeed transformed the narrative, presumably in a way that not all converts fully realized at the time. This was often a transposition from the oral to the written. There were multiple opportunities for the presentation of spiritual experience and of spiritual autobiography. In the early days of the Moravian and London Missionary Society, churches in Southern Africa, for example, people often related events relating to conversion and past lives in public meetings. And mission societies would hold experience meetings, which are separate from the regular cycle of services. Converts might also speak in church services, or more often in extemporaneous preaching themselves that was often outside missionary control. The Unitas Fratern, or the Moravian Church at Genadendal, required converts to testify to their experience to missionaries. To have a conversion story was a critical part of the conversion process, and missionaries regularly recorded brief lives of converts as a result, which was sent home to their home society. Brief details would be published every year for an Anglophone market in the periodical accounts and English language Moravian missionary journals that translated material from the original German. Life stories from Genadendal reproduced in the Moravian periodical accounts for an international audience are actually very brief and don't give a particularly vivid sense of individual lives. They're also sometimes anonymous. Nonetheless, some patterns emerge. The stories are often more jagged than those conveyed by white missionaries. Converts often spoke of their experience traveling and of their experience in losing things. Many had moved long distances to be at the station. Many had confronted opposition to coming. Many had experienced significant dislocation. Partners and children were left behind or died, and their stories of very violent, difficult, often disruptive lives. In a context, these are essentially farm workers experiencing enormous violence in a situation of coercion. So I'll just give you one kind of brief example of this somewhat jagged story told in a Moravian publication. So in 1806, for example, a Moravian team of missionaries recorded that one of our Hottentot or Khoikhoi women had told of her former life. She'd had 4 children by her first husband, who died young. She then married again but was taken ill, and the disorder having settled in her eyes, by degrees she grew blind. When her husband perceived that she was likely to lose her sight, he took her into a desert country not far from the Cape and left her there with a view that some beast of prey should find her and put an end to her existence. Nonetheless, he was tormented by bad conscience and would come every other day to give her food until the day came when he led her into the woods by the hand and again left her. Dying of thirst and hunger, she cried to God as well as she was able. Her prayers were answered by the appearance in the woods of a Christian man who heard her and brought her wine and bread. Thus strengthened, she endeavored to gain some habitation and groped her way out of the wood, crying continually,